Good evening. My name is Sean Anderson, and I am Associate Curator in the Department of Architecture and Design. My collaborator, my conspirator, my co-curator, Giampaolo Bianconi, who will join our illustrious guests on stage shortly, who comes from the Department of Media and Performance, and I would like to welcome all of you to the Museum of Modern Art for this evening's program. We have three very distinguished guests this evening: Beryl Korot, Zabet Patterson, and Tamiko Thiel, each of whom has contributed immeasurably to our development of the exhibition that opened yesterday to the public on the third floor. And I would also like to acknowledge those of you who have had some relation to the works that are on display, whether having produced them or collaborated with the people, some of the people who made them possible. Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age traces the evolution of computational thinking and the computer itself within artistic and design production from 1959 until 1989, the year the internet was made commercially available to consumers. Rather than considering the exhibition as an archaeology or nostalgia, cutting through rather than across these histories, I would like to propose this evening that, in tandem with our conversation, we consider the impact and flourishing during these decades of systems as structures. Before I talk any further, however, and give kind of introductory remarks before I invite our guests to the stage, I felt it might be nice to commence our presentations with one particular vision of the future, where the time of the machine and machine time meet.
Mr. Johnson, this is the computer center. So sorry to call you this late, but the computer is available if you want to get your urgent work done.
This man is working against time, computer time. Why? Because there are not enough computer facilities available today. So important research projects can't get off the ground. Some computers are fully booked for months ahead. Highly paid men and women have to spend hours on routine computations. Until today. Today, these expensive and frustrating delays are no longer necessary. Because Olivetti have developed Programmer 101, the world's first desktop computer. The Programmer 101 is compact. The Programmer 101 is portable. The Programmer 101 sells at a fraction of the cost of a large computer. Yet the Programmer is a true digital computer. It can be programmed to perform complex operations with the speed and efficiency of a large machine. To the businessman, the Olivetti Programmer can be used where it is needed, when it is needed, in the office or at home. The Programmer is efficient and so simple that a good secretary can learn to operate it in a matter of days.
A great moment in our history. Of course, those of you who have visited the exhibition would realize that the Programma 101 is one of the first objects that you see in the gallery, and is followed by a number of works that not only speak to the legacy of Olivetti as a technology company working with and across art and design, but also the fact that the Programma 101 was one of the most highly sought after so-called desktop computers by NASA, in fact, in its production of Apollo 11 program. Time-saving, labor-reducing, these are not terms that neatly apply to those artists and designers that worked with early mainframe computers and later with more advanced computing technologies. Rather, we might say the opposite. That is much work that went into the making of punch cards, of programming often room or refrigerator-sized computers, became a consequence as much about the subject of the computer as it was the object of the computer. Dogged critiques from the late 1960s and early 1970s exacted hyperbolic questions about the value of art, in fact, art production, created in part or by or through the machine. These seeming contradictions, indicated by the curator Pontus Hultén at MoMA, who first included a computer in an exhibition, is undoubtedly amplified further when he stated that machines, and by extension I'm also arguing for those thinking machines, such as the computer, he says that machines may be considered an enemy to humanistic values. Yet, if we begin to examine how approaches to the fashioning of a communicative substrate for the computer as a machine, such as these early typefaces and fonts that were the first to be used to read and be read, likewise by us, we realize that the computer and computational thinking by nature is embodied by and through language, networks of collaboration, interpretative experimentation, and ultimately projection. In the exhibition, one is able to move between manifestations of technology. By doing so, a spectator is at once producing and reinforcing language in which performance and the performative nature of texts, be it through proto-artificial intelligence or a film script, or that of an indicative matrix of lights, that of the prosaic cube and square, or even so-called quote-unquote black box, are complementary to those socio-political dilemmas from which these artists and designers sought to puncture or amend. Throughout these tendentious 3 decades, we are able to view a coalescing of practices across the postwar era that allowed for specifically, highly specific forms of cultural production into which all of these artists and designers intervened. The incomparable Alison Knowles, whose seminal work, A House of Dust, also in the exhibition, once said of her collaboration with Marcel Duchamp, she says, "Let us say that the work provides for your experience, but what you bring to it is the biggest ingredient, far more than what is there." In fact, when we see works by Beryl Korot, who we'll be speaking with this evening, is that the work and the work of the work, a circular logic that speaks to system thinking, to construction and display, is also about interface. How each of the artists and designers came to the computer without a finite conclusion in mind is unique when considering that computing today exerts a precarious pull toward the means meeting exactly the ends. Except, of course, when your mouse stops functioning, as it did today, while I was trying to finish my presentation, which ensued a number of questions of where I could find another mouse so I could continue finishing my presentation. Each of the works presented in the exhibition, including those beyond the gallery that will be discussed this evening, are emblematic of this institution's legacy, and also that of our inextricable reliance on the computer as a machine, medium, and method. And this was a video, but let's see. Oh, sorry. As many of the works attest, the impeccable stories we will hear this evening, whether occupying a wing of a building for which one was once forced into a timeshare system to gain access, or in the privacy of our back pocket, with its quote-unquote labor-saving yet labor-making systems, in and out of place, ultimately the computer has become our inescapable mirror. To return for a moment then to the 1970 exhibition, to our future history, what brought us here this evening, Hulten, the curator, says, by the year 2000, if we believe in life or art, we must assume complete domination over machines, subject them to our will, and direct them so that they may serve life in the most efficient way. In planning for such a world, artists are more important than politicians, and even than technicians. Even though we have both on stage and in the audience this evening, we could not agree more. Thank you. So with that, I'd like to bring to the fore Gianpaolo Bianconi, who will be moderating this evening's discussion, Tamiko Thiel, Beryl Korot, and Zabet Patterson. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks all of you for coming tonight. I think to get this conversation started with this tremendous reserve of brain power sitting next to me, I want to start by asking each of you a question about your works in the exhibition and their relationship to something Sean touched on in his introduction, this idea of coding or working with some form of code as an interface. Beryl, do you want to speak a little bit about text and commentary in that context?
Sure. Text and commentary is really a conversation between an ancient technology, the hand loom, which is also the first computer on the face of the earth in that it was the first punch card technology, and the new technology at the time. The piece was made in 1976 of video. It really gives within the space 4 different ways of saying exactly the same thing, but within the limitations of each of the media that are saying what they're saying. So if you walk into the space, the first thing that you see is an 11-foot wide, five weavings, 11 feet wide, that have very small changes of pattern within each of the weaves if you look at them very closely. It also has a counting system that creates the design of the weaves themselves. The stripes that you apparently see are kind of measured, and there are these tapestry holes that I built into each of the weaves that actually stand as pauses in music, as rests in music, in terms of a counting system that I created for the design. The weaves face 5 monitors, and each of the monitors, in a sense, over the course of time, reflects on each of the weaves. It kind of gives you insight into what's going on that you wouldn't see. So a detail in the weave that might be an inch square is enlarged maybe 30 times on the video screen. The other thing that happens is that on the loom, we're building a pattern according to a numerical structure, line by line. Video, 30 frames per second, is creating an image line by line. Sometimes within the piece, you see the beater creating, pulling down a thread and beginning to fill the screen, reflecting back on the weaving that faces it with the viewer kind of in between. There's also video notations of each of the weaves that shows the different programs, the five different programs that were created to make the pattern. And each of those notations give you the threading instructions, which are done by hand, for that particular weave, as well as the foot treadling instructions for the weaver to construct that weave, to construct that pattern. So you have this old tool with hands and feet instructions that give it this well, I was just going to say something that we were talking about earlier, but I think we'll talk about that later. And in the room also are pictograms. Now, the pictograms are a notational system of the 33 minutes of the work. Pictograms, ideograms were a very, very early linguistic system, which really interested me, that period of time where language was first getting notated, where we were not near a phonetic system, but we were definitely in the visual realm of translating speech into pictures in lines that could be read as thoughts. And I guess for me, the piece comes out of an early insight from 1974 when I realized that the information, I was co-editing a magazine called Radical Software at the time, and the information, which was kind of reimagining the information environment in which we live, but the print on a page is obviously encoded, decoded in lines. The weaving is encoded in lines, and video is, as I mentioned before, is encoded in lines. So this relationship was very important in an earlier work and in text and commentary.
And Tamiko, your CM2 supercomputer, which you saw a sort of hint of the lights on the outside while Sean was speaking, but now you see the full thing behind you, was a piece of hardware designed to work with code and also had this kind of skin that could be read or is highly suggestive of some kind of code. I wonder if you want to talk about this object a little bit.
Yeah, and actually, is this on? There you go. Actually, if Gordon Bruce could stand up and take a bow, he was one of the industrial designers together with Al Hawthorne, who is responsible for the exquisite look of the final machine. I certainly can't take all credit for it. Also, Ted Bilodeau, who can't come, was there. And we see in the audience also Dan Aronson, who worked with the MoMA restaurateurs. Dan, please stand up, take a bow, to do the random and pleasing pattern of the flashing lights. So I'm really delighted that we can acknowledge them, because otherwise the machine in the MoMA space wouldn't look the way it does. And the machine is or was a supercomputer, 1989, the fastest supercomputer in the world. That lasted 1 year, and now if you still have an old iPhone 5, that's about what the processing power is in today's comparison. But the shape of the computer, I was telling Gianpaolo that my, I come from a Bauhaus lineage, so to speak, and my father, as an architect, actually worked with Marcel Breuer and with Walter Gropius, and so I grew up with this form follows function dictum, which actually doesn't come from Bauhaus, but from Louis Sullivan. But it had to, anything that I came up with had to be, had to express function in some sense. And through a wonderful article by Sidney Lawrence, Clean Machines at the Modern, which was talking about this machines at the end of the mechanical age exhibit at MoMA, he gave me the vocabulary to be able to realize and express that with a computer, you now have a symbolic machine. It's a symbolic processor. It's not expressing its function with gears or with any moving parts that you can see. It's all hidden in the traces of the printed circuit board, in the traces on in the chip itself, and the cables, which are totally unreadable. So yes, we created the machine to express the function and the form of the machine, 64,000 plus processors, all working in parallel, connected with a 12-dimensional internal network, 12-dimensional hypercube, a cube of cubes. And you see the external hardware structure is a cube of of 8 cubes. But you see into the machine through the translucent doors. You see the inner life of the machine, because those lights are not an add-on, they're not a decorative effect. They were on the board from the beginning, and at some point we said, let's move them to the outside edge. Let's make the doors transparent so that the inner activity, the inner life, the inner thinking of the machine can be read from the outside, can express itself to the outside world. And there is actually one person who worked on the machine, Mary Lou Jepson, she worked on it as a user, talked about how at some point they didn't have a fast enough data output from the machine, and she said, well, it's got lights, and the lights are, each one of them is connected to one of the over 4,000 processors, and we can just program those lights so that they give us the data out, and we make a video recording of the lights blinking, and that's our data output. So this was really a wonderful way of using the lights really as a way for the machine to speak directly to its programmers. And I only heard that maybe a year or so ago. It's only one of many, many wonderful stories about how the interior lights of the machine are really able to speak about its activities to the outside world if you can only understand their code.
And Zabet, I want to ask you, in your work, you've focused very importantly, I think, on specific technological tools and the artists that used them to create works, like Stan Vanderbeek and the SC4020 at Bell Labs. And I think it's been mentioned a couple of times already tonight, but the machine show at MoMA in the late 60s seems to be a kind of touchstone that people come back to. And I'm wondering if, we have two objects that we're talking about tonight primarily. One is a supercomputer from the 1980s. One is a video installation from the 1970s. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how art historically we might think about the relationship between these objects and how they might change how we think about a certain trajectory of post-war artistic production.
So we've got these very different objects on the table. We've got, on the one hand, something that seems to belong to the history of art very clearly, a gallery installation. On the other, we've got an actual functional supercomputer. But both of these works are about artifact, they're about process, and they're about programming. And typically, in thinking about them, the tendency would be to shuffle them off into different histories, to shuffle them into a history of art and a history of computation. But set up in this show, you see them against each other. You walk around just a little wall. And in doing that, that looks back to some of these earlier shows, the machine at the end of the mechanical age, the information show, where you had artifacts, technological objects, put next to works of art. And they were also put next to works of art that used computational technology, as well as ones that were influenced by a kind of computational thinking. And so I think in restaging these and putting these together, we have to start to think about how we've written our histories, what's gotten put in particular categories and what's gotten left out. And in looking at these together, I think that we start to see more overlaps between the development of post-war art and the development of computational technology than we may necessarily have thought previously. And we start to have to think the development of art post-World War II, also post the beginning of the informational or cybernetic age, in light of the development of computational technology. But not just computational technology kind of writ large, but in terms of specific artifacts, in terms of how specific technologies, how specific machines work.
And I think, Beryl, this might be an interesting place to talk a little bit about your work on radical software in terms of how we sort of reconstruct the kind of discourse that was taking place at that time. You were one of the founding editors of Radical Software in the early 1970s, before you made Text and Commentary, and I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about your experience with that publication.
Well, Radical Software came out in 1970, and it was the direct response to the Sony Portapack entering the world in the late 1960s and being accessed by an enormous number of really talented and really people with who were trying to reimagine the information environment in which we were living, who were talking about media ecology, who were talking about breaking up the relationship between broadcast television and the viewer, who were coming up with ideas for creating new formats for conveying information, who were thinking about cable television. That seems hard to believe. I was actually looking at a Radical Software #1 the other day, and it's hard to believe that there was this point in time where people were thinking that cable television would be something other than it turned out to be. But they were at that point, and looking at the electromagnetosphere and figuring out how information would be allocated. So Radical Software came into being by some of us who were beginning to work with the new information tool, the portable information tool, sync sound, magnetic, live feedback, and create new kinds of spaces for presenting information. I particularly got interested in the multiple channel format because multiple channel forced you out of the broadcast sitting in your living room type of relationship and made you go into a public space to view this work. And also for me, because it was multiples, that was when I actually discovered the Loom as an early programming tool as a way to really think and understand multiples from the most sophisticated technology on the face of the earth at that point that had actually dealt with multiples. But Radical Software was trying to, was almost like a precursor to the internet in a lot of the thinking, in that it talked about access to information, decentralization of information. At a certain point, we had, instead of copyright, we had an X to copy. We farmed out issues to people throughout the country who had who were involved in different ways of experimenting this. So it was almost like farming out issues for people who were creating their own little websites. And we distributed the paper. We would drive across the country with 10,000 issues in the car and distribute it to college campuses. So it was a fantastic, and the way it started was really just sending out a questionnaire to people. And everyone we sent it to answered, and it was this feedback. It had no, it was just open to people to communicate with one another. So it was a very kind of special type of magazine that, and that was a very special period of time, I think, in recent art history. For Lower Manhattan was kind of a mecca for a kind of work that was being created in almost every medium at that time by artists who were just exchanging information, and it was a very generous, very high-powered place during that late 60s, early 70s.
Absolutely, and it strikes me that you, Tamiko, when you were designing the CM2, were also working in another kind of mecca, maybe for a different kind of work being done in the 1980s, Cambridge, Massachusetts, where you worked on the CM2. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of what you felt the needs in terms of information sharing were, and processing information, and kind of realizing some form of networked communication that maybe informed the creation of the supercomputer.
So you mean not within the company itself, but sort of in a broader scale?
Well, in the company too, yeah.
Yeah, actually, there I have to again defer to another person at the company, Brewster Kahle, who I think the company really got moving in 1983. And Danny Hillis, who invented the connection machine as his PhD thesis in the MIT AI lab, had started the company, talked to me a couple days after graduation, and brought me on board. He and I were 25, 26 at the time. Other people like that whippersnapper Dan Aronson and Brewster Kahle, who went on to do the Internet Archive, were 20, and they had been talking about designing the machine before. And Brewster was, I always call him Brewster Big Data Kahle, because even as a young man, he was thinking about this Library of Alexandria concept of making all the information in the world available to anyone at any time. And he saw Danny's idea for the connection machine as the way that could happen. And we were all on the internet. We all were on email and communicating with each other in that way. And that was a normal way for people in academic and scientific, especially scientific academic communities, to communicate with each other. So we had this worldwide communication within our restricted circle of people. So part of it was just a very natural thing for people who had quote unquote grown up, at least in their college lives, being on the internet, to think of that as being a natural way that the whole world would move. And that happened really when the web came out in 1994, but by that time, thinking machines was sort of slipping into bankruptcy. That's another story. But basically, we were all in a community. I came out of a community that was where it was just very natural. When you had a party, you'd organize it by sending out emails. This back in the in the 70s. So I would say it was more that was the general culture of the entire company. And I was a geek too. My background was mechanical engineering, product design, Stanford product design, Hewlett Packard, where I worked. But that was all. Everyone in my personal world was able to communicate with at least other people of the same ilk. So it was just a very natural thing, and the desire was to use things like the connection machine and the idea of moving then at some point from this very contained machine to larger and larger systems that would be span the entire world, where people could communicate back and forth. And at some point, that was realized after the death of the company in cloud computing. So very natural evolution, and really I embodied it really only as a member of this larger community, to whom it was as natural as perhaps for other people telephoning was at that point.
And you've spoken specifically about one sculpture that served as a kind of touchstone for the design of the CM2. I'm wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit.
And this, can we bring up the image of Pomodoro's Sfera? This was, now we're jumping a little bit from communications, which is more of a software function, to a hardware function. And the connection machine, if you go up and look very carefully at the center detail, the waist, and this is a Gordon Bruce and Al Hawthorne idea. I can't claim credit for it. You see the same sort of interlocking teeth, and that came up in a very early sketch of theirs, where they say, connection machine, we're going to, let's lock those cubes together. And I had this image floating in my mind of Pomodoro's spheres and cubes that have this sort of structure that, to me, being a science fiction fan and being very much in this geek world, I thought this looked like a spaceship that could contain an entire civilization that could, sail on into the future, and that embodied somehow the type of vision that we had for this supercomputer that would also bring us into the future, and that would also realize our dreams of the future in some sort of object. So yeah, there was a very strong play in sort of the back of my mind between these sculptures and what I wanted to achieve with a connection machine, and it came echoing back from Gordon and Bruce and Al Hawthorne. So the whole process of, I have to say, of developing the machine was so intensely and closely collaborative that it somehow, at some point when I wrote an article on the design of the connection machine, my sister said, "Well, this is very interesting, but what did you do on the machine?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, I was like, running the project." And he said, "Yeah, but it's all we. What did you do?" It's like, oh well, I guess I was, using Mark Twain's. People with tapeworms and editors should use we, and I. Anyway, so so at some point I had to back up and say, wait a minute, okay, yeah, some of that we is other people, some of that we is actually just me, but we were so all much of a we that it was hard to separate that out.
And I'm struck in your description of the kind of interlocking image of this sphere. I think we have an image of Beryl's sketch from Dachau, 1974. And Beryl, this was your first multi-channel video installation that you made before text and commentary. And it was, if I'm not mistaken, around the time you were beginning to work with the Loom. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about this work that preceded text and commentary.
But this was actually a notation I did that was put in a drawer and never shown until Steve Sachs said to me, "Don't you have anything else from that piece?" And I said, "Well, I'll look through my files," and I found this thing sitting there all folded up, and here it is. It's really it was just another, I mean, Dachau is a whole long thing, but I mean, this particular thing is just a 4-channel description running down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, second by second of what the piece looks like. If you were just to notate it in terms of passing time, the little empty spaces are these blanks for rhythm that I put throughout the work. And it was just another way of, at that time, I guess notation in some ways, notational thinking was somewhat in the air. We were talking before. I would go onto the subway. I had started to weave, but Dachau was not, I only used weaving, I was not a weaver. I only used weaving as a thinking tool. And we were talking before, I would go on the subway and I would see people with patterns on their clothing, and I would go, oh, that person's wearing a 4321 shirt or something like that. And so this was just in the air. And Dachau was a piece that I did. I went to the concentration camp in Germany in 1974, the former site, and came up with a 4-channel structure based on a weaving structure. The basic weave to bind a cloth is 1s and 3s and 2s and 4s. And the piece, the video part of it is revealed in time, showing, taking you through the site of this former concentration camp, which is hard to explain in terms of this, because this is a total abstraction of that. I did want to say one thing about radical software, though. Radical software, we talked about the information environment. Later, we began as a culture to talk about the information highway more as a delivery system. Radical software was really people experimenting with this new technology in new ways, very personally, and at the same time it was also critiquing technology. and critiquing the manufacturers who were creating the technologies. I was looking at an early issue and Frank had written something called EVR is Evil, and it was some kind of a thing that CBS, I think, was coming out with at the time, which was really part film, whatever it was, you were going to buy it, you were going to be trapped into it, you were never going to be able to exchange anything you made on it with anybody else. And there was a lot of proprietary stuff that was going on at that time. And as it would come out, we would kind of critique it. And there was just a way of looking at technology at the time, though we were experimenting with it, we were also looking at it and not just accepting it and trying to say, how does this play a role in our lives? How is this going to make our lives better? Not just accept what is thrown out to us, which right now is a huge problem. And we do need a radical sofer, so somebody should start a magazine.
I think we're ready for volume 3, it would be now. But Zabet, yeah, we were talking earlier about sort of the experience of looking at those table of contents for those early radical software issues, and how the kind of like diverse voices that come in there and how prescient it seems with regard to our own relationship to technology today. But I think one thing I wanted to ask you about was there's a kind of cleaving almost between practices like radical software that take a more critical DIY approach and sort of more institutionally aligned experiments where artists are partnering with large corporations to gain access to mainframe computers. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about these two kind of different strands of artists approaching technology at roughly the same time in absolutely different ways.
So radical software is using this terminology that invokes a computational imaginary. So it's talking about software, it's talking about hardware, but it's grounded on the Portapack. And this is something which was suddenly available and which people could use. It wasn't actually necessarily that expensive. But then for artists like those who partnered with experiments in art and technology, a lot of them wanted access to mainframe computers. And they wanted access to extreme high-tech materials. So Stan Vanderbeek really didn't want to work with just kind of hand-drawn animation. He wanted to see what was possible with computation. And Stan Vanderbeek couldn't just go out and buy a mainframe. That wasn't something that was even remotely possible because these machines, as was mentioned earlier, were room size or refrigerator size at the smallest. And so the only way for artists to get access to these really expensive machines were either to go through educational institutions that might have some of these machines, but at that point they're waiting in line with lots and lots of other people who want to access these machines, as we saw in the opening video, or they turned to institutions like Bell Labs that had a really open policy and that were willing to have both scientists and artists experimenting with really these multi-million-dollar machines without necessarily asking them for an output. And so this was something that happened a lot over the course of the 1960s, in the latter part of the 1960s. But then as it turned into the 1970s, you started to see with the collaborations with the LACMA Museum, a real backlash against artists using advanced technology, because a lot of the reviews brought out these artists as being complicit with this technology and complicit with the kind of warmongering through using it. And so at that point, people really started to kind of turn away from some of these experiments. They started to be experiments that seemed less profitable, both for the artists, but also for the corporations, who were kind of like, hold up, maybe we don't want to have artists coming in and messing around with our machines. Maybe this isn't actually in the best benefits of our legal department and our shareholders. And so people started again to kind of to shrink down and to think more critically, as I think radical software does, about what these technologies are on a larger scale and what these technologies are doing, what kinds of systems are being imposed by these technologies as we don't think about it, as we don't pay attention to it. And so things like radical software were trying to get us to pay attention to some of these larger computational systems, even as it's working very explicitly through the meaning of video and the specific programming of video.
Yeah, and I want to go back to you, Beryl, and ask you about that process of working with video in text and commentary. I think you see directly in the videos you working at a loom, but it's also that process of labor is also in some ways reminiscent of the process of labor that went into working with video itself at that time. I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the process of making this piece and also about the process of accessing the tools you use to make it.
Right. Well, when my Dachau piece was actually restored, and the same thing would apply, I had done the editing for both text and commentary and Dachau 4-channel, 5-channel pieces on reel-to-reel tape. And when they were restoring it, the engineers said to me that they couldn't believe how these videos linked up with one another because they were so precise in the relationships because there was no time code. So one of the things that I enjoyed doing actually was kind of beating the machine. So you know, anyone who edited put an X at a certain place on the tape deck, and you had a stopwatch, and you knew you punched in a button when you were ready to make your edit, and how quick you are between your eye and your hand was part of the skill and craftsmanship of working this way. When you had to do it across 5, you had to, it wasn't just relative to a half a second off or something like that. I mean, you really had to get into the stopwatch and the grease pencil. And, you know, somehow I did that. I enjoyed doing that. It definitely was labor, but I was concerned at the time. There was a very cavalier attitude in a way in terms of working with early video, much of which I admire. I'm not saying anything against it, but it wasn't my way of working. And so that kind of preciseness was something that I didn't want to throw away. There's also the line between crafts and art that I was thinking about a lot at the time that you don't see as much in non-Western cultures, but definitely in the West, that's much more of a division. So I was also interested in that kind of labor. And you do that, I mean, and that just continued working with After Effects or something like that with, you know, hundreds of layers later on when I did an opera, 2 operas. Or even these video paintings I did later on. It took, you know, huge edit decision lists and numbers and whatever ultimately, but labor.
Yeah, and Tamiko, that brings to mind sort of this idea of the distinction between art and craft that you were very aware of in your works. Brings to mind, I think, something that you mentioned when you were first talking about the lineage between Kepis and Noguchi in the sort of like formation and the way in which you've approached your work since then, and I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Right, yeah, and we have this slide that I put together, that one image from Juri Kepish, who was my father's mentor, and really, as he always said, I seduced your father into leaving naval architecture, which is engineering, shipbuilding engineering, and becoming a designer, an architect interested in perception and sequential spatial experience. You know, and so I found these 2 images, one from Juri Kepish with his Bauhaus connections, and then this photograph of Noguchi's wonderful sculptural floor lamps. I think they're probably about as big as a human. And this is aside from, Mom, I won't ask you to stand up, but maybe you'll go like this. Mom, can you wave your hands? So this is my mother, Midori Kono Thiel, a artist artist specializing in Japanese, various types of Japanese culture, calligraphy, master calligrapher, master shamisen musician, and also a donor who helped get the ball rolling on fundraising for acquiring the machines. So if Mom wasn't there, I wouldn't be here either, and that's in a couple of different senses. But so for that, we grew up in this household that was very determined by Japanese culture, and Dad looking at it from the standpoint of architecture and stroll garden design, and Mom looking at it from the perspective of everything in the universe, as she's a very broad artist. But that as Beryl mentioned, there's a division between art and craft in Western society, which is just not there in, for instance, Japanese society, where a ceramic bowl, which someone would say, oh yeah, that's either a minor art or it's just something, an item of daily use. A ceramic bowl can be one of the highest art forms in Japan, and so Noguchi taking the simple lamp and transforming that into sculpture, I think was also a wonderful example of saying objects of daily use, common objects, household objects, can also be works of art. And what is that line between a work of art and a work of craft, which always in English has this sort of derogatory sense. But of course the Bauhaus was exactly the institution in Western culture that tried to blur these lines and say, no, design is an art, and art is design. So that's very much an atmosphere that I grew up with. I thought was natural. I thought everyone thought that way, and therefore also I think coming to the connection machine, or coming to any use of technology in art, the technology of sword making in Japan, for instance, that's also a high art. And if you've ever seen a samurai sword, and if you've ever held it in your hand, there's an incredible balance. So the idea that there's a barrier between technology and art, between craftsmanship and technology and art, was really not existent in my upbringing, and I've always rather much chafed at the Western art world's strictures that say, especially when I was, working with video or so, or interested in photography, and at that point, the art world saying photography is art and video is art is a very recent phenomenon. It was really the 90s. And how long had this been around, and how long had people been using it and creating artistic works with it? So I even hope that before I die, the art world would consider digital art, computer-based art, also a form of art and not a form of technology or craft. But we'll see. Might depend on how long I live.
It's a really long time.
But Zabet, it is true that technology changes our relationship to craft as a category, and I'm wondering if, in your work, that's something that you've kind of brushed against as you've kind of tried to resuscitate certain technological projects or technologies that have an almost traditionally peripheral relationship to art history.
So craft isn't the word I've used precisely, although it is definitely an applicable one. What I've worked with is this strange tension between artists going to a lab and producing work, and scientists and engineers going to the same lab and producing work. And so in the case of the Howard Wise Gallery computer-generated pictures show, they took work that had been made as part of vision experiments and experiments in kind of visual graphical production from computation. So work that Bell Labs considered science and engineering and expected to see published in science and engineering journals, and they showed it on the wall of the gallery. And at the same time, you had artists coming into Bell Labs, and then they would produce works that would then be shown as underground film, or works that would be shown as computer-generated imagery. And so you have all of these different sites where often the same work would pop up, but if it's hanging on the walls of a gallery, it's art. If it shows up in a scientific white paper, it's technology. And Bell Labs, as an institution, was very uncomfortable with having scientists produce work that was then pushed into the category of art. And they did not necessarily want to have artists crediting Bell Labs either. And so you wind up with all of this very hybrid work that becomes really problematic in terms of how do you show it? Which histories do you need to contextualize it? Where do you put it? Do you put it in the museum? Do you put it in a history of technology? And how do you articulate these very hybrid objects without having to limit them to a history of, say, the history of art has not historically, as Tamiko pointed out, done very well with explaining kind of the specificity of technologies. And when these technologies move past film, which has begun to be institutionalized, into computational technologies, which are hybrid and complicated, and people don't quite know what to do with them. And then you also have the additional problem of how do you preserve them? How do you show them? How do you curate them? And these very complicated machines showing up in these different contexts.
If they were in art schools, don't you think, if some of these machines were in art schools, don't you think, and accessible to artists, I mean they're probably too expensive, but then the atmosphere might change, the attitude might change.
Oh, but everyone has a laptop these days, and that hasn't changed much. But it's changed a tiny bit, the attitude of the art world, but
I think it's changed the attitude of a lot of younger artists.
Yeah, I think so
But
too.
then you run into the problem again of how do you preserve this work? So I teach a lot of art that's internet-based, and some of it disappears periodically and then has to be recoded and re-emulated by groups like Rhizome. And then personally in my work, I'm really interested in these large machines that artists made work with. And so we were speaking earlier that we tend to think of technology as progress. We naturally move from the CM2 to the iPhone. And in doing that, we lose sight of like the specificity of the CM2, the way that its architecture enables particular things. So part of what I want students and artists that are in training to be able to do is to look back, and I also want this for engineering students and people dealing with technology, to look at some of these strains or avenues of computation that we've lost sight of, and these architectures of computation that we've lost sight of, so that maybe we could think about a computation that isn't teleological, that doesn't necessarily make us wind up with the iPhone and Facebook and the internet as it is.
And Beryl, this seems really pertinent to your work because your approach to technology has always been historical in a sense. And you've looked back to sort of ancient foundations of computing with the loom, and even farther in works like your video opera, The Cave, or later works of yours like Babel. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about your approach to technology in a kind of longer duration of history after text and commentary.
Well, the technologies that I'm involved with are really very accessible they're not, they're ones that have already entered the public space. And so the things that I've done, the opera with Steve Reich, my husband, two of them, one actually on technology, and the other one, The Cave, which was a 5-screen work that we went to the Middle East and we asked people, you know, who for you, to Israeli Jews, to Palestinian Muslims, to Americans, who for you is Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac, and used the tools of our times, what we considered to be the folk tools of our times, videos, samplers, working with things like stop action sound. So things that were already kind of malleable within our reach, and radical software and video technology was kind of like that too. So, you know, in that sense, I've kept, the technology has just been another tool in my toolbox, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that's most interesting about your approach to the loom, a very old technology, is that you approached it in a form colored by your surrounding or your interest in much newer technology at that time. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not. You worked with the loom, in a sense, colored by your interest in video at the same time.
Yeah, well, video led me to it. I mean, yeah, I wasn't drawn to the loom until I realized it was a programming tool. There was some kind of article early in the 70s or late 60s in Scientific American, actually, on the Jacquard loom, and that really got me realizing that. And also just some kind of predilection as a human being that, not that there's nothing new under the sun, but certainly I don't believe that. But certainly in some ways I do believe that there were geniuses throughout time, and there's always things to learn from that time. And coding, you know, the Babel text, which was a text actually in Genesis, which was an early text about technology. There are all kinds of incredible radical software ideas related to that over centuries in terms of commentaries about how people worshiped the bricks and turned from each other in need. And so the ongoing dialogue is not just with the tools, but a lot of the ideas around the tools that have been sustained over long periods of time.
And sort of on the opposite side of that, you, Tamiko, have continued to work most recently in augmented reality programs. Is this something that you see having, I feel like it's something that a lot of people are interested in or excited about. Do you see it having as broad or foundational an impact as something like computing technology on our society?
I do think so. And I've started working with geolocative augmented reality in 2010. This was the image here is an intervention, an uninvited intervention we did into the Venice Biennale. I say we, it was a group of us artists. This is my own personal work. And it was a realization that with the GPS capabilities of and processing capabilities of the smartphone, that you can overlay any site in the world with virtual content. And people always say, "Oh, this is completely new technology. It's been never been done." But you know, it's. I think as Beryl was saying, there's this huge, vast cultural lineage. If you think about storytelling, if you think about people walking through a city or a landscape and saying, this is the building where Pablo Picasso worked when he was living in Paris, or these buildings are on a meadow that was here when this battle happened, or so. Stories and relating stories to sites is augmentation. It's the human culture has always augmented places, objects with stories about how they were important to you personally, to your family, to your society, to a whole culture, and use them as markers of this vast, thousands of years of human culture, history, experience that we carry around with us if we choose to live into it. And that is what I see as the power of something like augmented reality, where you can take a specific location, and for instance, in this image, you see images of artists who were censored. They're being sort of enclosed by these terms of censorship, and on the far right, you have Georg Schneider, for instance, who wanted to put his big black cube in Piazza San Marco, which is where this is located, and was told, maybe not after all, and without really being given reasons, then was not allowed to continue building it for the Venice Biennial. And the figure in the middle, Emily Jassir, I might be mutilating her name, but she wanted to take the Vaporetti stations in Venice and redo the signs that instead of saying Rialto in Italian letters, it would be written in Arabic letters, and she wanted to do that with all the Vaporetti stations in Venice. And that was also first approved for biennial, and then the approval was drawn back without any clear reason. So I really love to use the technology as a way of memorializing places and spaces. My mother and I did a whole series of 18 sites in Seattle where we chose sites that were important to us, either personally or as a family or as Japanese Americans. And we came up with words and phrases which she then wrote in her beautiful calligraphy, and I placed them there as augments. So this is, I personally think this sort of augmentation is something we've done for thousands and thousands of years, and this is merely the latest way of doing it. And I hope it will live on despite constantly changing technology, because it's speaking to a very, very, very basic human, emotional, and cultural need.
And speaking of the latest way of doing something, Beryl, you've started working with textiles again now through a more digital interface. Is that right?
Oh, the digital embroideries. It's yeah. I mean, it's. I feel I wanted to. I couldn't stand any more programs, having to update programs and things like that. No more. So I've been drawing, and then I met this, I was introduced to this wonderful printer, Judith Solotkin. And so instead of adding like a layer of paint over, or another layer onto a drawing, it's threads that are getting, there's a machine that gets programmed, and the type of stitching, where the threads cover, or actually they don't quite cover. They add another kind of light layer as the drawing builds up, as opposed to using pigment or something like that. But it is threads, so I kind of enjoy that. It's going from, we used to say we thread the video machine, right? And it's the threads in the loom, and now it's these threads where even the computer has a large impact on a sewing machine.
Do you miss working with the old hand loom?
You mean with weaving?
Yeah.
I only did it for that text and commentary. I mean, I was never. My weaving was, with video and with how I used multiple channels to, kind of think about how information is constructed and how a narrative can be constructed with the way in which you combine multiples, getting clues from the loom, and realize that without going back to literary sources, which many people who did experimental video did use as sources, my source was actually structures that I learned from a visual technology, the loom, in terms of pattern creation, whatever. It actually has within it narrative structures. So, you know, in Odysseus, you can talk about Penelope, you know, spinning yarns or whatever for 20 years till he returns. But so the metaphors hold weight, but not only do the metaphors hold weight, the actual structure of how threads on a loom are combined actually can give clues to how to put a narrative together non-verbally. You know, so no, I don't miss.
But this idea, thinking about what you were just saying in terms of how you can thread together a narrative, I'm wondering, Zabet, if you can think about that in relation to the exhibition and how a kind of narrative can be threaded together art historically that includes both works that were made directly with computers and also works that were made thinking about computers as a kind of abstract device or as a rhetorical device.
Yeah, so in looking at it, you've got a lot of really interesting narratives. One is kind of the evolution of particular technologies, because you've got some very specific technological objects. You've got artists working with technologies and working in between. Potentially, Vera Molnar, for example, is working in between working with a computer and executing a drawing according to algorithmic instructions that she gives herself. Hannah Darbovin is working with a computational imaginary and is making drawings, but those drawings are essentially programmed. They're algorithmic drawings. And this goes back as well to Cage's harpsichord piece, which is programmed. It uses a computer, but as he points out in some of the interviews with it, the computer was more trouble than it was really worth. And maybe he should have just kind of done it with the I Ching and just gone through that himself. And so you can see him really kind of comporting himself to utilize computational technology, whereas what he's interested is the imaginary that you get from computational technology and how thinking through computational technology changes particular practices. And then also, as I was saying earlier, embedded in the exhibition is also a history of institutions and a history of the Museum of Modern Art as an institution. So you've got the Ramac circuit board, which was collected by Arthur Drexler in 1958, and then shown in a number of different exhibitions since then. And each time, it's about this transition from a mechanical to a computational age. But each time, this one object gets mobilized a little bit differently and gets shown initially as a design object, then gets shown in conjunction with objects that are more considered to be art. And so as you look at the different objects, the different artworks that are in this, you see them being knit together to produce a story about thinking machines, about how we think about machines, how we think with machines, and how we imagine machines as themselves thinking. But you also see the possibility of these objects going on into the future and going on to be remobilized in different kinds of histories, different kinds of narratives, and that we will see them in a new light as they come up again and again, and as you're able to revisit them.
Speaking of remobilizing, I think we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience now, and Sean is going to join us on stage as part of our panel. We have two lovely friends with microphones in the audience, so if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi. I just wanted to make more of a comment than a question. People might be interested that there was a commune in San Francisco that existed south of Market area from 1971 to 1980, and they actually had a mainframe computer. And so while it's true that most of the world did not have access to mainframes, there was this one little blip in history that people might want to research. It's called Project One.
What kind of computer did they have?
It was an XDS 940. That's it. Thank you very much.
There's a video about that commune that was made by Optic Nerve that you can track down and watch if you're so inclined. Do you have a question, Sean?
No one in the audience? Well, let me think if I have a question. I think a lot of my questions were answered earlier in the process of the discussion. I wasn't prepared for a question. Yes.
Oh, there's one.
Here.
I had a question for Beryl. You mentioned that it mattered to you to use multi-channel video so that the piece had to be experienced in a public space. Could you talk about why that was important?
Yeah, well, Radical Software was all about changing the relationship that people had to broadcast television. It's hard to imagine now, but that was really, we had radio, and we had print, newspapers, and we had broadcast television. And it was a one-way delivery system from people to their homes. And with the Portapack, people began to rethink that relationship. The whole decentralization of information, which later, took its real form in the internet at that point. So being the editor of a magazine that was talking about all these experiments towards changing that relationship to broadcast television, what better form than literally, a lot of the stuff being done at that time wasn't really changing the form so much. It was putting new information in, but it's like the actual formats for conveying that information were not that different from what had pre-existed. But with multiple channel, it was really different. And you had to really break up that relationship by saying, no, you can't even look at this medium without coming into a public space. And then, you expanded it, because you could put numbers. So it got to be a larger image, and you played with time against itself. But that was basically the idea, was that you just made them leave their home.
So, Tamiko, I liked you talking about growing up with form and function being the same thing. So I'm interested in the other people on the panel, and specifically the curators, talking about how they react to that feeling, because it's clear that often in museums, I've found as a technologist, that there is a separation of what's appreciated and what's not, and so I'm just interested in comments.
Well, I think from the beginning, because I come from an architecture and design department, as it were, Gianpaolo and I were adamant that we would show works of design, specifically computers and machines, including the CM2, alongside the works of art. And I think it's important to recognize that the exhibition includes works from every single department in the museum, including the archives. And so on one hand, you could read that as saying, okay, well, the institution has had a long history of working with and across these disciplines. And on another more kind of cynical or critical way, you could say, well, where have the starts and stops been within the museum in terms of thinking about the machine? And so it was important not only in the description, in the narratives, in the stories that we were trying to tell, that it wasn't necessarily a reliance on the institution, but how the institution began to disseminate, to rethink, and to use the machine even from its inception, from the museum's inception, as a kind of common denominator that is seen. And as Zabet so eloquently said, to think about now the machine into the future. What will it mean in 50 or 100 years to see these works again? Not that we'll show them in 50 or 100 years. I hope we show them more soon than that. But to think of the kind of arc of technology as both emblematic and representative, not necessarily of progress, but I would argue that it's emblematic of the socio and the political and the economic manifestations that are happening in track with our societies.
So there were key and very interesting MoMA exhibits that touched on machines or touched on electronic circuits and things, but they seem to be very isolated. And I'm wondering if, I look at this exhibit and the pieces that were there, and am totally surprised, even with my knowledge of media art history, of finding out, what pieces came from such early times. Do any of the three of you who are dealing with, the history of art and with museum culture, is there any hope that this will be a landmark exhibit that not only is one of a row of punctual exhibits over time, but that will start a wave of appreciation for computer art?
Well,
I think that there is this kind of weird thing that happens. So you get kind of the machine art show in 1934. And then you've got the machine at the end of the mechanical age in 68, then information 70. And then you've got 010101 and bit streams in 99, which are at the Whitney and the SF MoMA. And so there are these kind of 10 to 20 to sometimes 30-year punctuations in.
I'm not living a lot longer,
But no, that said, I think that there are a generation of curators, and both of you will be able to speak to this more eloquently than I can, that are being trained in the conservation and the presentation of these kinds of works, and that they are becoming more integrated into collections and our works that are being shown. And I think it's really important to think not just about shows, but about having these works that utilize computation be part of the permanent collection installs. So when you go to kind of the Pompidou, now you'll see alongside the 20s and the sculptures and the paintings, you'll see videos, you'll see the films that were made at that time. And so my hope is that these works will become so much part of the discourse that when you're telling the story of post-war art from 45 to the present, you can't tell it without looking at computers, and you can't tell it without looking at works that utilize computation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the most fun things about working on an exhibition like this for Sean and for me was that you get to look at a really terrific collection through a specific lens and see how something is already part of the DNA of an institution, and kind of bring that to the fore. And I think as it goes not without saying that for both of these works specifically, they require specific conservation efforts. I'm looking at Peter Oleksic in the audience, in order to make them something that is showable, something that is lendable, something that is not just collected, but something that is activated each time. And I think that that's all part of what you, Zabet, were talking about.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to maybe ask you to bring the conversation back to the notion of gender in particular. I think it's not a mistake that most of the panelists are women, and there's a subtext throughout the exhibition, I think, of the confluence of cybernetics and second wave feminism and a lot of other things that were happening at that time. If you read the wall text very carefully, there are some really crucial statements by artists like Chana Horvitz or Agnes Dennis or others. But I think particularly in Beryl's work, this idea of textiles, which was so central to a notion of women's work and artistic practice in the 70s, maybe signals another set of questions. The role that women played in the development of computing, I would say also in the development of video installation, but I mean, you could take this in a lot of different directions. But maybe just looking back a few decades later, how does that history shift, and what possibilities did it open up, do you think, for artists working now?
Can I interrupt you?
Well, women were there right from the start with video. And, I think there was so much newness with the medium itself that maybe I think there were women in different places feeling different things. There was I think in the 80s, for some reason, I can't really account for this, women were more concerned with kind of projecting a kind of feminism, whereas the women that I knew early on who were working at the very beginning were just really into the tools and what it was doing, which is kind of curious. I think it's going through those phases right now, but there was something, I think there was something liberating, and we knew that we were working with technology, and that was really great to have that feeling, because we knew that women hadn't really had that role, that wasn't really considered a woman's thing to do even then. So there were many women working at that time. I'm looking at Nina now, and Joan Jonas, and Tony, and just Dara Birnbaum. I mean, there were so many women who just went for it and were encouraged, and I think we encouraged one another. I think we just did it. The time was right. The 60s had kind of opened a door for that.
There's a lot of hands going up.
Can I just comment on, it's interesting listening to this and growing up as a child in the 60s and beyond, becoming a female, being a female, and doing whatever I wanted, feeling very empowered. If I wanted to be a surgeon, I wanted to be a mathematician, whatever I wanted to do. The computer seems to me very empowering as a common theme of the whole last half of that century and beyond. It continues on today. So in terms of whether it's women or just anybody just being empowered, it seems like a major, major theme running through it. And even the linear thinking, it seems as though now, a lot of the millennials, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not as linear in thinking, but the anchor of the linear thinking becomes the computer as a base. Still empowering to then go ahead and with more spokes, to not necessarily be a linear thinker, having the computer as an anchor, and still people are empowered.
I would just argue to respond not only to your great comment, but also Stuart's question was, in effect, can we think of computing and computational thinking and the computer itself from the late 50s onward? I'm referencing an image by Berenice Abbott of, its title is woman rewiring a computer at IBM. And then subsequently, the last image, or one of the last images in the exhibition by Lee Friedlander from Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, of two women literally burying themselves and their bodies in the computer. And I can't think of two more divergent moments in time, yet connected by and through this interface that would be the machine and be the computer. And yet we rarely, I would argue until maybe recently, think of the gendering of the machine or the gendering of the computer. But rather, as you rightly said, it is a platform, it's a stage, it was a jumping off point. It was something from which great potential could and did happen that wasn't necessarily reliant upon the dialectics of gender or who was making it, but maybe perhaps it was the processes and the engagements with and and I would keep coming back to this term, collaborative nature of working with this technology that made it such an extraordinary moment in artistic and cultural production.
Well, this has been an amazing mix here, and I appreciate what everyone said. I think a few things we should go back to. We have these merging histories, but at the beginning of cybernetics, we have the Macy conferences, and we have important moments that don't come into a lot of art history, but now, as you said, and I think it's clear, we're dealing with social, political, economic forces. One side note, even in popular culture and movies, we have this reference to women as computers, and we know what happened during the space age, and people are familiar with Hidden Figures. But I just want to name two people and two ideas that maybe would spark up a little bit more conversation. I know we do have a reception afterwards, so I don't want to take too long. The first one would be Norbert Wiener's idea of the human use of human beings. And that's extraordinarily important, of course. But the one I like the best and refer to the most is Gregory Bateson and Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Now, I do know that, that in Radical Software and in the Whole Earth Catalog, a lot of these ideas were prevalent at the time. But I think it's extremely important that we get back to this spiraling Vico's history, in a way, and we find that we're at a kind of end game now, and I think it's appropriate, as Beryl had mentioned, and she wasn't very explicit, and I won't be either, but I think that cycle is complete now, and we have to reorient ourselves to some of these ideas that are important. Human use of human beings and ecologies of mind. I'll just use those two titles. Thank you.
That's another evening.
I just wanted to put in a comment about the gender issues that, I had never heard of Vera Molnar's work until relatively recently, and I know, looking at VR work and the work of VR artists, that actually with all of media art, I've always seen tremendous numbers of women doing media art, and then specifically, with VR, when I think back of the people who were making virtual reality art in the 90s, then a lot of the works that I think are really stunning were by women, and then in the latest wave of VR, well, for one thing, they're all saying, well, VR started in 2014, and I've been working with it since then, and therefore, I'm one of the first people to use VR. Not true, sorry. But again, all of a sudden I start hearing people saying, well, how come it's always men working with VR and where are the women working with VR? And I'm sitting here flabbergasted and saying, when I think of, for instance, the work in VR done in the 90s, then yeah, there's some men there too, but the pieces that I think are really stunning are from women, but some of them are known and some of them are not known. And how come I didn't know about Vera Molnar's work and the early sort of plotter drawings work that I knew from that time were until recently all men. So I'm sorry, but there really is this phenomenon still of, there's plenty of women out there working with it, but if they're not as seen as important as the men, then I'm sorry, their work doesn't get put into books and doesn't put into the history and doesn't get pushed out there. So that's still something that's happening.
I definitely agree with that. I think that in too many ways, a lot of work keeps getting pushed aside or just not forgotten, but stuck in the archives and not brought back out. And this does go to also the question of women's participation in early computing, the role of Ada Lovelace, the question that was brought up by Catherine Hales in the title of her book, that my mother was a computer. People assumed that she was talking about some kind of cyborg robot thing, but no, she was pointing to the very real fact that her mother had programmed early computers and was one of the women who had been instrumental in making these machines work, back when this work was not considered to be as important as the scientific research and the wartime research that it was supporting. And this is something that, again, I think we have to be attentive of how we write and how we tell our histories, of who we put on the stage, of which works we bring out to show and to point to as the crucial, important works that are made with the plotter, the crucial, important works that are made with computational algorithms. And these are something that, again, far too often women's contributions gets pushed to the side and gets talked about less.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. I'm curious, comments from the panel in regards to post-structural theory in regards to both the narrative of the exhibition as a whole, but also to the craft of art making and also computational thinking.
Good night.
Wow. That's another panel. It'd be a fascinating panel, but yeah.
So what aspect of post-structural thinking are you after? Well, I mean, if it's, I'll start with something relatively accessible, maybe. It's been a while since I delved into this world, but I'd like to go to the work of a man, unfortunately, sorry guys, but of Gianni Colombo. One of the first works seen in the exhibition. And Gianni Colombo and Alviani, who's also shown on the same wall, were very much interested in part-whole relationships. That part-whole relationships both in science, in nature, but also in linguistics, speaks to language that is not only representative of, say, the big us, but also speaks to that the individual unit can affect and does affect the larger whole. And likewise, that the larger whole can affect the individual unit. So that work, on one hand, is a kinetic sculpture. It speaks to arte programmata, a moment in great kind of flourishing of Italian modern design. But you could also say, and maybe this is many years down the line, in rethinking the work of arte programmata, but also the works of Korot and Tamiko Thiel and Shana Horowitz and all of the great artists who are shown in the exhibition as rethinking the means by which the part doesn't necessarily equal the whole, but actually supersedes the whole. And so that art, whether it's made through or by or on a computer, is more than the sum of its parts, is more than the work that went into it and more than the work that we show in a museum or in a gallery. And so when we're speaking of the work, the body of the work, maybe it's time to perhaps not rely so much on post-structural theory, but to, and I'm not saying you do, but to consider that the works that are on display in sum speak to the larger trajectories of modernism, of the transformation of the modern into a contemporary, that these stories are both universal and particular to this institution. How's that for post-structural theory?
I think that's a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All of you are welcome upstairs to the reception that is being organized for us. Thank you.